Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, here in the Bonn Center for Dependency and Slavery Studies and out there on the internet. My name is Wolfram Kinzig. I am a professor of church history at the Protestant Theological Faculty of the University of Bonn and one of the principal investigators in the Center for Dependency and Slavery Studies. On behalf of the center, I welcome you all to a new installment of the Joseph C. Miller Memorial Lecture. It is in more ways than one a special event in our series. It is the first time that a church historian is contributing a paper to our series, long overdue, if I may say. It is the first time since the start of the pandemic that we are able to listen to the lecture in person again, here in our center in Bonn. And to me, it is a special event because it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you not only a most prestigious colleague, but also a dear friend, Peter Gemeinhardt from Göttingen. Peter insisted on coming to Bonn and to speak to us in person because he wanted to get to know our cluster of excellence firsthand and to talk to us face to face. We are very grateful to him that he took the long trip with the Deutsche Bahn westward. This is still an adventurous journey because there is no quick east-west rail link. But you may take the super rapid ICE south and north again, or you may take it north and south, or you may take the unhurried Regionalbahn through the lovely valley of the Sieg and marvel at the beautiful landscape and many grazing cows. Whatever way, it takes a long time, but he made it. For those of you who are not familiar with church history, let me briefly introduce Peter Gemeinhardt. He's beyond doubt one of the leading experts worldwide in the area of the history of the early church. Peter Gemeinhardt was born in Hamburg in 1970. He studied Protestant theology in Marburg and Göttingen and ultimately received in 2001 his doctorate in theology in Marburg. Subsequently, he was trained and ordained as a pastor. Ultimately, however, he decided to stay in academia. He moved to Jena, where he wrote his Habilitationsschrift, his second book. After his habilitation in church history in 2006, he was appointed as a professor of church history first in Mainz and soon after in Göttingen, where he has taught ever since. I will not bore you now with enumerating the many book series and academic journals which Peter is editing or co-editing. But I must briefly mention that Peter Gemeinhardt has been enormously successful in attracting outside funding for a variety of research projects. In particular, I want to mention one project. In Göttingen, he initiated and chaired the interdisciplinary Sonderforschungsbereich, the special research area Bildung und Religion, funded by the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft. When one looks at his wide-ranging research interests and publications, three large areas are particularly prominent. The first is the history of early Christian doctrine. Peter's doctoral dissertation on the so-called Filioque controversy, which contributed to the division between the Western and Eastern churches, is meanwhile the standard monograph on the subject. Peter is also interested in an area which is rather unusual for a Protestant theologian. He has widely written on early Christian saints and has produced a definitive biography of Anthony the Great, who is often called the father of all monks. If you want to know what a saint is, don't go to the Pope or to Cardinal Wölki, ask Peter. Finally, Peter wrote his Habilitationsschrift on Latin Christianity and classical education and has continued working on the matter of early Christian education ever since. In a way, he has summed up the results of his research in a brand new book which has just come out 10 days ago, or 20 days ago, 10 days ago, very recently, and which I am certain will influence and shape the way we look at late antiquity in the future. Geschichte des Christentums in der Spätantike, the history of Christianity in late antiquity, in Tübingen 2022. But today we will hear from him about early Christian education. The title of his paper is "Did Late Ancient Christianity Depend on Classical Paideia, and did it ever get rid of it?" Please welcome Peter Gemeinhardt.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for this very kind introduction. It will be difficult to live up to the expectations you raised. And welcome to all you here in this room, in the Center of Excellence, and in the worldwide web. I insisted on coming to Bonn, this is true, because I seize every opportunity to talk to people in presence. We all had to be online all the time for the last 2 years, and it's great to be here. And I hope we will, in the web and in the room, get into a lively discussion. What has education to do with dependency? With respect to present-day Germany, one might be inclined to answer that there's a problem with accessibility of education. While in principle, schools and university are open to all people, in fact, the possibility to acquire education depends to a significant degree on the social background and on financial resources. Therefore, while the pursuit of happiness, or less pathetically, the free choice of a professional career depends on the development of one's abilities, talents and inclinations, other circumstances prohibit the realization of such individual freedom by being trained and by forming oneself through, as we in German are used to say, Bildung. In other countries, the situation might appear different. I want to hint briefly at the Declaration of Human Rights by the United Nations from 1948, which states in Article 26, everyone has the right to education, and a few lines further, education shall be directed to the full development of the human personality and to strengthening of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. And if one looks at this declaration, I think it's not only the case in Germany that such a declaration of human rights had not been universally translated into action yet. Now, the modern dependency of individual and social welfare and education is not the problem which I will discuss today, because this is not one of my research areas, as Wolfram highlighted. But it has to do with the topic of my lecture, the impact of classical education on late ancient Christianity and the latter's reflection and appropriation of education. The history of this relationship is complicated. In Christian sources, we frequently encounter a fear of being too dependent on education. To be sure, such discourses were not concerned with public education of the many. In pre-modern times, most people never attended school, illiteracy was usual, and education was confined to a well-to-do minority. At least literate education, as you could acquire it in the Greco-Roman schools, it was confined to the upper strata of society. But some of these privileged people felt threatened by dependency on education. Why? Let's look at Jerome. Died in 419, a literate representative of this newly established religion, Christianity. He narrates in a dream vision that he was accused by Christ of using pagan education. And I give a longer quotation. Suddenly, I was caught up in the spirit and dragged before the judgment seat of the judge. And here the light was so bright, and those who stood around were so radiant that I cast myself upon the ground and did not dare to look up. Asked who and what I was, I replied, I am a Christian. But he who presided said, you lie. You are a follower of Cicero and not of Christ. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Instantly I became dumb, but amid the strokes of the lash, for he had ordered me to be scourged, I was tortured more severely still by the fire of conscience, considering with myself that verse, in the grave, who shall give you thanks? Yet for all that I began to cry and to bewail myself, saying, "Have mercy upon me, O Lord, have mercy upon me." Amid the sound of the scourges, this cry still made itself heard. At last the bystanders, falling down before the knees of him who presided, prayed that he would have pity on my youth, and that he would give me space to repent on my error. He might still, they urged, inflict torture on me, should I ever again read the works of the Gentiles. Under the stress of that awful moment, I should have been ready to make even still larger promises than these. Accordingly, I made oath and called upon his name, saying, "Lord, if I ever again possess worldly books, or if ever again I read such, I have denied you." This scene became iconic in the Middle Ages. Only a century later, a similar experience was ascribed to the erudite and ambitious Caesarius, later Bishop of Arles. Jerome himself was accused only a few years later, this time not by the divine judge, but by a human being, his erstwhile friend at school, Rufinus. He accused him that he had not held his vow, but that he constantly read and quoted pagan authors. Jerome replied angrily that he simply had not managed to get rid of this knowledge because of his brilliant memory. "I can swear that I never read any of these things after I left school. I suppose that to escape from having what I learned made into a crime, I must, according to the fables of the poets, go and drink of the river Lethe, of the river of forgetfulness." Of course, this complaint was only meant to prove Jerome's admirable command of ancient literature and rhetoric, including mythological references. And after all, had not the Old Testament prophets warned to take dreams too literally? Augustine, the most influential church father of the West, did not suffer from such threatening dreams. But in his Confessions, he deplored the lasting imprint which classical schooling had left upon his conscience. It took him many years to fight back the temptations of knowledge, polished speech, and a brilliant career, things which he had once achieved by hard work. Augustine is a rare example of what we call in German a Bildungsaufsteiger, someone who has managed to obtain an illustrious professional position by his own strength, not by inherited resources or by being well connected. Like Jerome and other contemporaries, he declared his conversion to Christianity a conscious decision to leave behind his dependency on education. Later, in his treatise on Christian doctrine, he spilled much ink on the question whether it could still be employed for Christian purposes. We will come back to this. The observation that these reasonings were themselves rhetorically styled has led scholars to the diagnosis that late ancient Christianity suffered from dependency on such education. The classicist Meinhold Fielberg at Jena University reckoned Jerome's argumentation, quote, "a deliberate self-deception," because the Christian church had never tried to replace the public schools by institutions of religious education. And again, quote, "Christians grafted their faith and ethics only scantily onto humanistic pagan education, which they could never form according to their needs nor control." It is true that with few exceptions, there were no Christian schools in late antiquity. Only at the end of the Roman Empire and the West monasteries started to serve as substitute for schools, a development which entailed a thorough transformation of the notion of education as such. We'll also come back to this. Christianity participated in Greco-Roman culture. It made use of down-to-earth education, but also of the stylistic devices of the so-called second sophistic. And rhetorical performance was extremely helpful in establishing a newly founded religion on the late ancient market of lifestyles. And early Christians intellectuals excelled in this competition. While theologians repeatedly claimed that one should beware of such tools of education, or at least use them carefully and selectively, Christian life depended on practices of reading, writing, and speaking. After all, it was a religion based on scriptures and inhabited what Guy Strumza has called a scriptural universe. But Jerome, Augustine, and their contemporaries are only one side of this coin. In this lecture, whose outline I want to show you, I want to focus mainly, but not exclusively, on Latin Christian texts in order to approach the well-known topic of Christianity's precarious relationship to classical education from a praxeological point of view. To this end, I will survey different genres, epigraphy, hagiography, and homiletics, in order to describe the interwovenness of Christian and non-Christian cultural practices. This close relationship fueled the critical discourse on education. Education in Greek Paideia was something you could learn at school, but it also encompassed the ideal of the cultured individual who was free to dispose over his competencies. In other words, education involved dependency and freedom at the same time. It enabled agency, but presupposed loyalty. Therefore, we will ask, was such dependency on previous tradition and practice inevitable? Did Christianity not get rid of Paideia because it was not able or willing to do so, or did it consciously keep it and put it to good use? Such struggling with educational dependency contributed to a thorough transformation of classical education and enabled Christianity to survive in times of dramatic changes of its surrounding world. The question who was the master and who was the slave is not so easily answered as it might seem. So let's start with the first of three bigger steps, Paideia as a social practice and as target of Christian critique. And let's begin especially with a brief definition what we are talking about. Education often translates Greek Paideia or Latin eruditio. But this word, or these words, have a wide range of meanings. Paideia encompasses all kinds of education, especially teaching at school, but also the result of such a transmission of knowledge, being an educated man, or in some cases, a literate woman. Such education lay the groundwork for acting as magistrate, judge, or counselor, thus enabling young men to enter a public arena of competition. In Hellenistic times, the idea of Epicurean Paideia, well-rounded education, developed, containing advanced knowledge and skills in grammar, rhetoric, and philosophy. A concise summary is provided by the 2nd century writer Apuleius of Madaura. A wise man made his famous comment on dining. The first cup, he said, is to quench thirst. The second is to promote jollity. The third to promote pleasure. And the fourth to promote madness. We can have some practice afterwards. With the muses, it's the opposite. The more numerous and stronger the cups, the better they are for the health of the soul. The first cup trims the spirit with the literatus elementary lessons. The second equips it with the learning of the grammaticus. The third arms it with the eloquence of the rhetor. Most people drink to this extent. I myself have drunk other cups too at Athens. And then he continues for a while. For Cicero, such a banquet led to true humanitas. In early imperial times, Aulus Gellius confirmed that, quote, it is humanity, what the Greeks call Paideia, and what we term the fine arts. Here, Paideia comes near to German Bildung, and already Plato saw in forming oneself the ultimate goal of human beings. The famous Delphic inscription, know thyself, gnotis auton, originally a philosophical maxim, was, according to the Delphic priest and philosopher Plutarch in early imperial times, to be understood as exhortation to know oneself as a weak human being in opposition to the Almighty God. Philosophy, education, and religion were increasingly converging in the first centuries CE. Christianity thus did not invent the religious dimension of education. In a world full of gods and full of Paideia, the blending of both aspects was well underway. But education was also subject to critical debate. In his Sophists at Dinner, Athenaeus reports a saying of the founder of the Epicurean school. They quote, since Epicurus was not initiated in the educational curriculum, the mentioned Epicurean Paideia, he considered as blessed those who had likewise managed to avoid it on their way to philosophy. Here is the kind of thing he said. I consider you blessed, sir, because you've set out for philosophy pure of all education. The critique of formalized education is as old as the latter's invention by the sophists of the 5th and 4th centuries BCE. The Platonic Gorgias argues that philosophy might be fitting for the education of young men, but should not preoccupy old men. Criticism could be directed against the boring exercises in the lessons of the grammarian, and against the uselessness of the rhetorical gymnasmata and model declamations, which still in late antiquity evoked the heroes of classical Athens or the Roman Republic. Surprisingly, education did not suffer from its seeming irrelevance to daily life. Its primary aim was to initiate young people into the Hellenistic and Roman past and tradition. For this purpose, it was essential to know the foundational texts by heart: Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, Virgil's Aeneid, or the declamations of Demosthenes and Cicero. A man who was able to perform public speeches, like a Ciceronian, was regarded as eloquentissimus, still in Augustine's lifetime, while the church father reserved the epithet doctissimus for a much more thorough acquaintance with knowledge of God and the world, that is, with philosophy. Such deepened learning had ever been the privilege of a tiny elite. Philosophy avoids the crowd, thus Cicero. Schooling and philosophy could even be regarded as opposites, following a saying by the founder of the Cynic school. Diogenes thought it remarkable that teachers of letters not studied Odysseus' faults, but were ignorant of their own. That musicians, moreover, tuned the strings of the lyre, but had souls whose characters were out of tune. That mathematicians focused their attention upon the sun and the moon, but disregarded the things right in front of them. That rhetors were eager to say what was right, but not to do it. Early Christianity entered into this discourse on intellectual knowledge and the correct way of life. The North African apologist Tertullian postulated that Christians were not in need of a wisdom fashioned in schools, trained in libraries, fed in Attic academies and porticos. But he did not argue against the use of Paideia for Christian purposes as a whole, and his writings profited immensely from his excellent command of rhetorical skills and knowledge of classical authors. This same is true for his contemporary Clement of Alexandria and some other writers of this early Christian period. Rapidly, education became a tool in inner Christian debates. Opponents were accused that they had taken in too much Paideia. Marcellus of Ancyra, for example, criticized Origen, the most prolific writer before Augustine, for having been too dependent on education from the outside, exoten paidosis. And this education from the outside, Marcellus saw primarily represented by Plato. A special stance had already been taken by the 2nd century apologist Tatian, a native of Syria, who presented himself as barbarian philosopher and teacher of a genuine Christian Paideia, which was strictly opposed to Greek philosophy, but even Tatian relied on Paideia in order to refute it. Positive models could be found in the own scriptural resources. The apostles Peter and John were hailed for speaking with divine power, though being illiterate, agrammatoi. And it was a widespread idea that Christ did not send educated men and rhetors, but fishermen without education and shepherds, poor and ignorant people, in order to proclaim the Lord's message. Here quoted from Caesarius of Alba, there are many similar quotations. With such boundary making, Christians wanted to establish their independence from public schooling, where the poems of Homer or Virgil, full of gods and their quarrels with each other, served as textbooks of grammatical instruction. Teachers with Christian belief could simply not avoid dealing with them and seducing their pupils to idolatry, as Tertullian warned. But even Tertullian conceded that Christian children needed to acquire education to participate in public life. These Christian authors declared Paideia pagan or secular, as opposed to religious or spiritual knowledge, while the Greco-Roman schools had defined their subject matter as purely literary, in spite of the omnipresence of mythological topics and names. Later authors theorized this claim to Paideia. As is well known, Basil of Caesarea, in his address to the young on the value of Greek literature, recommended careful reading of said books with ethical value. Augustine, in On Christian Doctrine, justified the use of pagan education by hinting at the Israelites, who had rescued the gold and silver of the Egyptians, according to the book of Exodus. These valuables were the pagan sciences which the Egyptians had neglected, but which now would be put to good use by the Christians. So stealing was justified. In critical conversation with the grammarian Cresconius, Augustine pointed out that not eloquence in itself is good or bad, but that everything depends on what is said eloquently. In order to underline the primacy of Christian wisdom, he referred to none other than Cicero. Wisdom without eloquence is of little use, but eloquence without wisdom is often harmful and never useful. Augustine, in accordance with ancient philosophy, claimed that the life of the preacher was more important than his rhetorical abilities for his self-authorization. But still, his Orator Christianus resembles strikingly the vir bonus dicendi peritus, a good man skilled in speaking, whom Cato the Elder and Quintilian had praised. To cut a long story short, from its very inception, Christianity struggled with the fear that too much contact with ancient Paideia would cause contamination with the wrong gods. Augustine showed himself amazed that the world had believed the unbelievable message of Christ's ascension to heaven, proclaimed by man, quote, without instruction in the liberal disciplines, without command of grammar, without being armed with dialectic or inflated by rhetoric. So in the city of God. But had the faith been spread without the rhetorical toolbox of antiquity? Was there really a hiatus between Christians and Ciceronians? To answer such questions, it seems useful to distinguish between discourses and practices, and thus between different kinds of dependency. What we have seen until now are images of one religion struggling with one another, Christianity and paganism. And it's already a problem to postulate that there were two different religious formations who fought against each other. It's a Christian perspective with which Peter Brown nicely phrased, the pagans should know that there had been a war and that they had lost. It is proclaimed that Christianity had fought tooth and nail for its independency from Paideia, and that means against being contaminated with the wrong religion. This is a recurrent theme from the apologists of Gregory the Great. Jerome's and Augustine's lifetime might be considered the peak of these debates. Highly erudite converts entered ecclesiastical positions and felt the need to justify their use of classical Paideia. The spoiling of the Egypts mentioned above can even be regarded as converting education itself. As said before, such rhetorical constructions of boundaries required itself the command of education. Christians remained Ciceronians and dependent on Paideia, although they continuously declared their desire to get rid of it. So much for the discursive level. The history of research into the difficult relationship between Christianity and pagan education is often focused on this discursive aspect and accordingly on the paradox that Christians postulated a distinctly Christian education while remaining faithful to the pagan institutions and canon of learning. This is what Everett Cameron has termed the rhetoric of paradox. And this very morning, a book came on my desk which tries to solve this problem in one direction. It's by the Würzburg classicist Jan Stenger on education in antiquity, who says we should pay more attention at the theorizing of education. And this fits very nicely with my lecture because I want to focus on practices of education. So perhaps this diptychon will solve every question, but perhaps not. Anyway, I will explore the Christian approach to education by investigating concrete literary practices. To start with the obvious, Christians employed literary skills in manifold ways, be it in written communication for administrative or theological purposes, or in textual practices connected to piety and liturgy. As in late ancient societies in general, only a small part of those who identified themselves as followers of Christ and/or members of the church were literate. But among these happy few, there were not only bishops and theologians, people with formal authorization or, so to speak, with a license to write. Literary practices were also extant among other groups who did not produce philosophical or theological treatises, but disposed over a solid knowledge of literary culture, or at least an interest therein, and the financial means to promote it. Frequently, such groups of Christian literate agents interacted with each other. Looking at practices does by no means exclude theological reflection, as we will see, but it focuses on widespread kinds of literate activities. In modern terminology, on routinized processes which were not subject to conceptual debates. Such a practice theory of late antique Christianity investigates concrete actions as well as their structural preconditions. Speaking of education, in particular, it analyzes the interconnections of dependency on literary tradition and individual agency of literate people with religious motivation. A paradigm of such practices are funeral inscriptions. In 3rd century North Africa, a certain Marcus Antonius Faustianus Nepos Principinus died at the age of 18, was praised as gifted with extraordinary piety, famous for his manners and intellect, renowned in his native place, skilled in oratory, beloved with highest honor by his parents. Education and public fame were in the foreground, while the notion of piety remains unspecified. The young man was most probably no Christian, and piety is, as you know, a very wide notion in late antiquity, not necessarily in a religious context. But soon, tombs became a place where literary erudition and political career explicitly merged with religious affiliation, comprising different groups of believers and practitioners. Skilled in oratory recalls the classical definition of an educated man, as mentioned above, and significantly, virtuous and literary were combined in Christian contexts. Ambiguity was deliberately applied. Many inscriptions are identifiable as Christian only because they were discovered in Christian cemeteries, while on the text surface they remained perfectly traditional, not pagan or even anti-Christian. On a Roman cemetery, for example, the Rhetor Magnus was assured that, quote, no aging will destroy your honorary titles, for you will enjoy eternal life in books. A nice prospect for a German professor who writes books. In other words, a man buried by Christians and therefore presumably a Christian himself was commemorated precisely like his peers from the upper layers of Roman society. And there's no indication that anyone, cleric or layperson, was displeased by this. The initiative of such funeral inscription was generally and obviously on the side of the family or friends of the deceased person. Sometimes they were more friendly with regard to the Christian belief. The Roman senator Sextus Petronius Probus, who died in the 380s, was remembered as gifted with intellect, erudite in poetry, splendid, wise, humble, moderate, honest, estimated by all, moreover pious in kindness. But here piety was spelled out as distinctly Christian. Death will not be able to harm you, since you are dwelling in continuous praise of God and living in the kingdom of Christ without end. Such a blending of eloquentia and pietas is found in several inscriptions, some of which were even dedicated to priests. Pope Boniface III, died in 607, was glorified as versed in eloquence and pleasing in piety, only a few years after Gregory the Great, his predecessor, had harshly criticized bishops who cultivated and even taught grammar and rhetoric. Even Augustine, a severe critic of education, was commemorated in verse. In true Roman eloquence, he uttered mystical insights with thundering voice. So, under a depiction of Augustine in the chapel Sancta Sanctorum. In such inscriptions, we can observe a clear unaffectedness by theological discourse on education. Not Augustine himself was unaffected, this is clear, but his followers. People used the literary tools at hand to praise the dead and adapted them to the needs of Christian belief, without feeling dependent on something external. There was no theory of funeral epigraphic in late ancient Christianity, but a lively practice, mostly furthered by lay people. An anxiety of dependency is more explicit in another part of Christian literature, and you mentioned it before, hagiography, writing the lives of saints. Beginning with Athanasius' Life of Antony, this genre flourished in all Christian languages, far beyond late antiquity. At first glance, such lives represent the rhetoric of paradox, as mentioned above. Sulpicius Severus, in his most influential life of Martin of Tours, proclaimed that he would not follow the footsteps of ancient biographers. Most men, being vainly devoted to the pursuit of worldly glory, have, as they imagined, acquired a memorial of their own names from this source, devoting their pens to the embellishment of the lives of famous men. He himself had another goal. He wanted to guide his readers to true knowledge, heavenly warfare, and divine virtue. And all this is perfectly incorporated by Martin of Tours, as is explicitly said, a homo in literatissimus. In such texts, we observe a strong sense of dependency on education and an equally strong desire to get rid of its shortcomings. But we should not overlook the creative and transformative power of the hagiographical discourse. The notion of discourse indicates that the quest for genre hagiography, I mentioned it myself, has in the end not proven fruitful, despite many attempts at defining patterns of Christian life writing based on classical models. There's no clear past dependency in hagiographical texts, neither with regard to literary forms nor content-wise. A nice example is Jerome, who in his Life of Paul uses quotations from Virgil to embellish the encounter of the hermits Paul and Antony. While he certainly intended to show off his literary skills, and thus was widely accused as Ciceronianus, we should take earnest this endeavor to find appropriate forms for praising his favorite saint and communicate the ideal of Christian holiness, and thus he qualifies as Christianus. This means that one should take into account processes of reception and of production, of dependency, and at the same time of creativity. The first monastic saint ever is a case in point. It has been debated for more than a century whether Athanasius modeled his life of Antony after previous lives of Neoplatonic philosophers. And some colleagues are quite decided that this is the case. My dear friend and colleague Jan Bremmer in Groningen writes a paper on this every year. Myself, I've argued that biblical and martyrological patterns might be more important for the explanation of the overall shape and of many details of this most influential life. As always, the truth may lie in the middle, but in any case, it is impossible to view Antony and other saints as mere copies of pagan prototypes. And this becomes even more clear when we look at holy women, whom male hagiographers candidly ascribe spiritual teachings in order to express their own unconventional thoughts, as Maria Moncold knows very well. Such a literary strategy was unknown in pre-Christian biography. I suggest that Christian hagiographers were aware that they inevitably had to draw on their educational heritage and that they consciously remodeled it in the act of writing. The tension between the indebtedness to Paideia and the anxiety not to surrender to one's rhetorical abilities is finally most relevant for Christian preaching. Augustine, in On Christian Doctrine, provides a theory of using rhetorics for Christian purposes. Being himself not a fisherman, but a rhetor by training, he defines the primary task of preaching as teaching, which is carried out best by structures and persuasive speech. To succeed with communication on religious education, the preacher's life is, however, more important than flowery speech. And playing with the notion of Latin orator, Augustine postulates that a preacher must first become a person at prayer and then a speaker, sit orator ante quam dictor. Only by performing both tasks in right order, he might be called eloquent. And this is true even if he fails to reach the consent of the hearers. It is important to Augustine that while a Christian preacher will certainly try to teach and move his audience, and thus conform to two of the Ciceronian officia oratoris, he must avoid only to please them, delectare, for the sake of peasants, which was the road to success for late antiquators like Augustine knew himself from his time at the emperor's court in Milan. But again, the practice of preaching did not consist only of a superficial appropriation of rhetorical techniques. Christianity did not dispose over a different toolbox of speech, and in fact, they agreed with Cicero that the primary task of public speaking was the persuasion of the audience. Yet, they introduced at least two innovations. First, the homily, a speech devoted to the exegesis of an authoritative text, had been foreign to ancient cults, but became the most frequent kind of Christian preaching. It was fitting that Augustine's On Christian Doctrine proceeded from exegesis to preaching. Second, the warnings against the orator's deception by his own brilliance and the exhortations to speak simply to the simpletons reflect the general setting of Christian preaching. And I quote the 5th century preacher Peter Chrysologus, Bishop of Ravenna. We should speak to the populace in popular fashion. The parish ought to be addressed by ordinary speech. Matters necessary to all men should be spoken about as men in general speak. Natural language is dear to simple souls and sweet to learn. A teacher should speak words which will profit all. While such admonitions were brought forth in carefully chased words, they witness to a growing awareness that the closed circle of communication among the few highly educated men had to be overcome in order to fulfill the preacher's task, namely to go and make disciples of all nations and teach them to obey everything that I have commanded you, as the risen Lord Jesus Christ had put it. This is not to say that previous oratory was directed only at a very few people, but that only few participated in performing and in receiving and communicating education, so that this popular vision came true, making all nations to disciples, step by step testifies to a significant independency of Christian preaching from its roots. Of course, not every Christian preacher who claimed to use simple speech obeyed to his own rule. To speak in a persuasive manner wasn't optional, was essential, but as Augustine astutely remarked, preachers needed to pay attention to their style, because otherwise they would only reach those die-hard listeners who were so eager to learn that they would not shy away from a base and formless speech. And again, this is something about professors to think about. But not only highly elaborated texts, but also sermons and homilies with moderate ambition were written down, copied, and transmitted. And among the masses of Augustinian and pseudo-Augustinian sermons in medieval manuscripts, many belong to the low style, according to classical categories. In other words, formal eloquence was not the main criterion for choosing texts which would be preserved for future use. Therefore, we observe an adaptation and transformation of the genres and styles which Christians had learned in the public schools side by side with their non-Christian peers. This is also true for hagiography and even a less outspoken form for epigraphy. Inevitably, Christian written culture depended on traditional patterns, but in many cases, this was much more than simple reproduction. To be dependent on previous tradition, be it in respect to education or to other parts of the common heritage of Greco-Roman antiquity, did by no means exclude creativity and innovation, and such laying claim to social and intellectual freedom was not confined to the upper crust of the society of the Roman Empire. In a fourth and very short step, I want to raise the question, what happened to education when the Roman Empire broke down? As you all know, this empire, as every worldly dominion, did not last forever. When Augustine wrote his famous educational treatises, the western part of the empire was already in the process of disintegration and dissolution into several Gentile kingdoms. These dramatic events, traditionally summarized as Völkerwanderung, today more cautiously termed ethnogenesis by some scholars, led to significant shifts in all areas of political, social, and cultural, as well as religious life. Remarkably, Christianity survived despite its interwovenness in its environment. Here I only want to add some remarks on how dependency on education changed. A famous narrative tells us that education was rescued by the monks, but that with the rise of monastic education, antiquity gave way to the Middle Ages. This is briefly the plot of the final chapters of Henri-Irénée Marou's History of Education in Antiquity. To him, for the first time, we observe a Christian school which was, quote, totally focused on religious life and did not bear any traits of antiquity anymore in the monasteries. But such monasteries were not places without culture. While in the East, illiterate monks had been the rule, Western monasticism was a scriptural culture from the outset. Marou concluded, while during the 6th century, the night of barbarism spread, while in the Occident education was collapsing and nearly vanishing, we observe the lawgivers of monasticism doubling their efforts to proclaim for every monk, for every brother, the necessity to be able to read and to devote oneself to sacred lecture. Even in the darkest times, the Occidental monastery remained a place of education. While Marou, a classicist by training, placed monastic education in the midst of a narrative of decline, disruption, and reconstruction of the heritage of Roman culture, The French medievalist Pierre Richer saw late antiquity fading into a period of contemplation until Carolingian times. Richer observed that educated clergy knew that it was necessary to break with classical culture, but could not manage it despite conciliar decisions. Monastic schools would eventually provide a model for the establishment of new schools, but this would happen only centuries later. But yet, processes of teaching, learning, and self-formation went on. Tranquility was not complete. Recent research has highlighted transformation and continuity instead of break or rupture in general, and this applies to education in particular. A case in point is the enduring practice of catechesis, based on the Apostles' Creed and its many relatives, which Wolfram Kinzig has thoroughly investigated in some very well-received books. To be sure, catechetical sermons and explanations of the Creed, which survive from early medieval times, as you have shown, do not excel by their theological sophistication. Yet, instruction was reckoned necessary for every human being, male, female, free, slave, who wanted to receive baptism. While the educational institutions of the Western Roman Empire in fact declined in the 6th century together with their political contexts, religious education in Christian communities continued far beyond the walls of monasteries, and for this there were good pastoral and theological reasons. This is spelled out in a letter of John the Deacon to Cenarius, a high official at Theodoric's court in Ravenna. Cenarius had asked why people have to become catechumens before they receive baptism, and John did not hesitate to give an answer. I'm confident that you are sufficiently versed in such matters as to know that the whole human race, while still, so to speak, in its cradle, should properly have fallen in death through the waywardness of the first man, and no rescue was possible except by the grace of the Savior. There cannot therefore be any doubt that before a man is reborn in Christ, he is held close in the power of the devil. And unless he is extricated from the devil's toils, renouncing him among the first beginnings of faith with a true confession, he cannot approach the grace of the saving ablution. And therefore he must first enter the classroom of the catechumens. The catechumenate thus compensates for another kind of human dependency, sinfulness in Augustinian terms, original sin. One might object that catechetical instruction in 6th century Rome had not much to do with traditional Paideia, and traditional schooling had never been bothered with religion questions like sin, grace, or redemption. But it is clear from John's letter and other contemporary sources that Christianity did not try to get rid of education as soon as it could seize the opportunity. The earlier discourses on education had always encompassed critical reception and transformation, and the practice of communicating education to forthcoming believers continued these appropriations of classical Paideia. This is nicely indicated by John's remark that who wants to be baptized enters the auditorium of the catechumens. In origin, the lecture hall of the rhetor, the auditorium, had served as an eschatological place of everlasting learning of the redeemed human beings. I come to the end of my lecture and want to recall the strong images with which we had started. Jerome's dream and his renouncing of his pagan erudition and Augustine's exegesis of the Exodus narrative in favor of the spoiling of the Egyptians, of a justified use of classical education, albeit under severe restrictions. We have seen that such theorizing of the relationship of Christianity and pagan education is founded upon heavy assumptions. The existence of clear-cut religious groups, among them paganism, which in reality never existed, except for the mind of some 4th century pagans. The possibility of a critical selection of literature, which could be read without danger for the Christian self, as Basil of Caesarea argued, and a concept how classical Paideia could be fruitfully integrated into the communication of the faith, like in Augustine's on the first catechetical instruction. On the discursive level, all these prerequisites are available, and as early as by Clement of Alexandria in the late 2nd century, they were put together in a way which became characteristic of medieval theology. But as the subjects in a general education contribute to their mistress philosophy, so also does philosophy herself exist in the acquisition of wisdom. Since philosophy is the cultivation of wisdom, wisdom is the knowledge of divine and human things and of their causes. Now, wisdom is superior to philosophy, as philosophy is superior to preliminary education. So the issue seems clear. The liberal arts are the slaves of the mistress philosophy, and the latter is subdued to Christian wisdom. But as we have seen, this is not the whole story. The question, who is the master and who is the slave, cannot be answered straightforwardly. And the related question, who were the Egyptians and who spoiled them, only receives a clear-cut answer as long as one neglects the interaction and competition between Christians and non-Christians and within Christian groups. At the end of late antiquity, emerging Islam adapted Jewish and Christian practice and knowledge and, so to speak, spoiled them. Regarding the inner Christian debates, we have to distinguish carefully the levels of discourse and of practice. While religious identities were discursively stabilized, there were overlaps between options in view of education based on religious affiliation and continuously negotiated within and between different religious groups. In the midst of such plurality, Christianity stands out, as was already noticed and criticized by one of its despisers in the 2nd century, Celsus, as a religion which promoted religious education for all its members. Not because of theoretical claims, but because of this expectation, I would call Christianity in German a Bildungsreligion. And precisely in this sense, education as a human right might belong to the heritage of late antique Christianity, of course not exclusively. Finally, I want to underline that such adaptation and transformation was theorized by some authors, but in many cases we observe what might be called in sociological language doing education. Constellations of indebtedness to or deliverance from the shared heritage of ancient Paideia should be investigated not only by piling up rhetorical claims to independency from rhetorics, but also by looking at practices. Christians participating in literary discourses on the late antique world were eager to show that they were the true ears of traditional education, even if they claimed that they did not need it in reality. Now we should analyze, by praxeological approaches, how and to which end they filled new wine into old wineskins. It has long been observed that Christianity did not invent denominational schools. This would have prevented them from taking part in society, culture, and politics, the exception being monks who deliberately avoided such involvement in everyday life, but not in every case succeeded. The majority of Christians attended public events as well as religious feasts, and the erudite among them, including many ecclesiastical office holders, applied grammar, rhetorics, and philosophy to biblical text and Christian practices. As we have seen, this was relevant not only for theological and exegetical debates, but also for liturgy, venerating the saints, and commemoration of deceased family members. Here, we witness not to stable past dependencies, but to a remarkable amount of innovation and improvisation, that is, of independency. Instead of getting rid of ancient Paideia, early Christianity found ways, to put it in the words of the Gospel of John, to be in the world, but not to belong to the world. Thank you very much for your attention.